Predict, pick, and prevail in your fantasy football leagues with Nick Giacobbe and Nick Cap. From breakouts to busts, superstars to sleepers, these are the guys that will help you achieve fantasy glory. This is the PrimeTime Fantasy Podcast.
Welcome everybody to Season 4, Episode 4 of the PrimeTime Fantasy Podcast, where we give you our predictions, our picks, with the hopes that we help you prevail throughout the 2024 fantasy football season. I'm your host, Nick Giacobbe. Joining me is Nick Cap. Nick, we're recording. It's Saturday, August 3rd, and we have seen our first football game. Did you watch it? Did you watch any of it?
I watched clips. I did not sit through the whole thing. I don't want to watch people fighting for their jobs, for their careers, these third stringers. But the kickoff was interesting. That was definitely I think it's actually going to be really fun when we get more into it. I know a lot of people
those onside kicking rules are a bit absurd. Can't kick until the fourth quarter. I'm not a fan of that. But that, for the most part, will not affect our fantasy football season, but it could affect those NFL football season games. So we'll be watching that throughout the season. If this is your first time joining us, thank you so much. This is the PrimeTime Fantasy Football Podcast. You could find us on all your favorite streaming platforms, including YouTube if you'd like an audio and video version. And you could find us on all your favorite social media platforms if you would like to support the show. Today, we're going to delve into NFL offenses and talk about the 5 best and the 5 worst in terms of fantasy football. So we're not talking about what we think will be the best NFL offense. We're talking about which offenses you would like to kind of target for your fantasy football teams. Who has the most depth? Who has a bunch of skill position players? Maybe we're basing it off of ADP. Me and Nick have a top 5 fantasy offenses and a top 5 fantasy defenses that we are looking to either target or avoid. We're also going to have some little honorable mentions. For the offensive side, it's an offense that we think is going to exceed our expectations, but maybe not hitting the top 5. And an offense that we think is really going to miss those expectations and really be and really not live up to expectations. So without further ado, let us get into the show. So we're going to kick things off with our top 5 NFL offenses for fantasy football. And again, I know I just kind of described it, but this is specifically for fantasy football players that we want to target for fantasy football implications. We're not saying that these will be, the best offense in the league. I think last year it was the Dallas Cowboys and the Ravens, and I think they were the top 2 or so. But this is fantasy football implications, and I'm sure Nick has some reasoning behind his picks as I do, and we'll explain why we think these offenses are either the 5 best or the 5 worst. So I always like to let Nick, my counterpart as an analyst, go first. So let's go 5-1, and then maybe we'll do our offense that will exceed expectations. So who would you say is your number 5 offense that you would like to target for fantasy football purposes?
Before I get into all the details and my top 5 from 5-1, I do want to elaborate a little bit more on what Nick said. A big part of this is fantasy football. We're looking, when we took factors into this, we're looking at who are the top players and are they going to hit a bunch of metrics. So you're going to catch the ball, you're going to get yards, you're going to get touchdowns. Is it just more so one elite player like Lamar Jackson, where I'll say it right now, where the Ravens don't break my top 5 because he's so much more elite, but the rest of the team is slacked in fantasy. I think that if you're a top-heavy team, it's a lot better for fantasy football. I don't want a player like Romeo Doubs who's going to get 8 touchdowns vulturing from Jaden Reed and from Christian Watson like last year, but only gets 60 catches, 700 yards. That's not a reliable fantasy option. Is your offense playing up-tempo, or are you running the ball a lot? The Cowboys last year, like Nick mentioned, number 1 offense in football and in fantasy football. Well, they played 66 plays per game. The Seahawks, who were one of the lower, had 58. That's a difference of 90 passing attempts and 54 rushing attempts per game. Your schedule, is it easy? Is it tough? You have defensive coaches, tough defense. Are you expecting shootouts? Your division, what do those matchups look like? And like Nick said, this is fantasy. We're talking ADP. Are you these skill position players? Are these guys at the top of the board? Is it a good value? Is it too close to the ceiling? What's the differentiator? And there's a lot of great football. When you're in the offseason, everybody looks great. You're going to be nitpicking, and that's exactly what you got to do when you got to decide between 1 and 2, 2 and 3, and all the way down. So kicking it off, number 5, someone that I'm going to guess a lot of people would have ranked 1, 2, or 3. I'm going with the Detroit Lions a little bit lower. Amon-Ra, Gibbs, Laporta, all elite finished top 10 at their position in PPR last year. Any of them can finish number one any given week and probably will at some point this year, if not multiple times. They had the third most fantasy points per game scored as a collection, and the fifth most actual points per game in football. And they played the second most plays per game. So they're checking a lot of boxes, plenty of shootouts in that division. And they got Ben Johnson back. That's a lot of check marks for a great offense. My only real concern is that these guys are going so high in your draft, and rightfully so. There's no value to the picks. Amon-Ra needs to finish 1 or 2 to be a great pick. Jahmyr Gibbs needs to finish top 5 to be great pick. Laporta needs to finish not just 1, but probably needs to outscore the number 2 by 50 plus points to be worth the middle of the second round, which is where he's going. And the team is a lot deeper this year, which is definitely a concern. Like I mentioned earlier, you want to be top heavy to be good for fantasy football. Well, their receiving core got a lot deeper. They added Donovan Peoples-Jones. They obviously have Jameson Williams, Khalif Raymond. They also brought in Traquan Smith. That's 4 deep ball catchers. And like we said, the Lions, high-powered offensive line, high-powered offense. These guys are going to catch a couple balls a game deep down the field, take away yards, take away touchdowns from some of these other guys. And with the ADP, you need to invest into these guys the first and second round. If you don't take them in the first or second, the top 20 picks, you're not getting any of these 3 guys. You cannot afford to have people vulturing touchdowns like David Montgomery and these other receivers. So by no means am I saying they're going to bust, but they don't have the fantasy value of some of the other teams that I have above them.
A lot of my teams actually do have higher value up the board, and I'm okay with saying that because I still want a piece of the offenses that I think are going to finish as top offenses. So I'm going to go with the NFL's Cinderella darling, whatever you want to call them this year, but the team that everybody's all over, and that's the Houston Texans. And that's because they have talent all over the board with their offense, giving you multiple opportunities from the first probably 8 rounds that you could pick a Houston Texan from. And there's a lot of value going around. So I'm looking at CJ Stroud, who's going right now as the quarterback 6. He finished as quarterback 11 last year in his rookie year. Joe Mixon, running back 14 right now. He was running back 6 last year with the Bengals, and now he's going to an offense that could potentially score more points than those Bengals. Nico Collins finished last year as your wide receiver 16. He's going right now as your wide receiver 16. Stephon Diggs going as your wide receiver 24, and Tank Dell going as your wide receiver 32. Respectfully, last year, Diggs finished wide receiver 12. Diggs finished wide receiver 9, Nico Collins wide receiver 12, and Tank Dell wide receiver 39. So you have an opportunity to pick any of these 3 guys, receivers, throughout your draft. Dalton Schultz also finished as tight end 10 last year, now going at tight end 14. Wouldn't recommend him, but still an option. They finished with a total of 377 points last year. That was 13th in the league, so not a lot. But again, they did get better, adding both Joe Mixon and Stephon Diggs. They finished with 39 touchdowns, 15th in the league. Again, not crazy numbers, but we're looking at a big jump in the sophomore year of CJ Stroud. They do have the 4th hardest strength of schedule. And although that does worry me, that does mean they're going to play some tough competition. They're going to play their division winners. They're going to play the Baltimore Ravens. They will play the Kansas City Chiefs, and they will play the Buffalo Bills. That will all, those will be tough games, but those will be games that they're going to have to score points in. So I'm confident that if you're taking somebody from this team, you're going to be pretty happy with it. My favorite value is Joe Mixon, who's going right now in rounds 4 to 6, depending on your ADP, depending on your league. But that is my favorite value out of all of them. As for the receivers, injuries happen. I hate to be that guy, but an injury will happen at some point. You can't bank on that, obviously, but I think all 3 receivers will be very involved in this offense. So I'm confident taking anybody, and I'm okay with the ADPs. I think you know what you're getting from this offense. So Nick, I'll let you go now. Number 4.
I'm putting the Miami Dolphins. There is nothing like having a stat sheet stuff for a quarterback, and especially one that just got paid, in Tua Tagovailoa. On top of that, we know the offense is elite. They have Tyreek Hill, who was just named the best player in football by the players, who was chasing 2,000 yards last season. We have one of the best potential running back breakouts in Devon Achane, who averaged the 5th most points per game at the running back position, and their number 2 running back, Raheem Mostert, who would have been the RB2 if he didn't miss the last couple weeks with injury. Then you have Jalen Waddle, who's immensely talented, missed multiple games, but we're expecting a bounce back. Last season, they averaged the 2nd most points per game in football and the 2nd most fantasy points per game in football with an elite offensive coach. That is a recipe for success. My only concerns is they had the 10th least amount of plays per game. So they're not keeping up the up tempo that a lot of other teams do, but they were successful when they did it. And a lot of their stars have injury concerns. Surprisingly, the only player that I listed that didn't get hurt last year was Tua, who's the one guy we always have said we're concerned about injury. And also the decline in production last year. At the end of the season, well, the beginning of the season, up until week 13, week 14 was their up until week 12 and week 13 was their bye. They were averaging 32 points per game and 92 fantasy points per game for fantasy. That is immensely big. The problem was when the weather got cold in week 14 to 8, they saw a 10-point per game deduction in their points per game and 32 points per game deduction in their fantasy points per game. Now, you might say, oh, that must have been the schedule, must have been tough. Well, this season, their schedule is even harder. They have 11 games against defensive head coaches, including their 6 division matchups. And they end the season in cold December and January, where Tua struggled, hosting the Jets at Houston versus San Francisco, championship week at the Browns. And if you play into week 18, you're going up to MetLife to see the New York Jets one more time. So that schedule is not appetizing, but we know those stars are. So you can be as confident as you want. Those offenses are elite. Like I said, I think they're the 4th best offense for fantasy in football. But the strength schedule is tough. If I'm being honest, I'm probably going to draft a couple Miami Dolphins myself, but I might try and trade them before the deadline because I really don't want that playoff schedule.
I echo all of Nick's points, as I also have the Dolphins as my 4th ranked offense here. Some other points here: they did score the most touchdowns in the league last year at 61. I like Mostert's value a lot going off the board at wide receiver 26. Obviously, Tyreek Hill, if you're getting him in round 1, that's a slam dunk pick. I do not like Jalen Waddle's value. He finished last year at wide receiver 34, going off the board right now at wide receiver 15. I think there's better values. The other thing I will mention here, Nick, is you talked about their schedule. They actually have the 7th easiest strength of schedule. I know the back half of their schedule is a little bit tougher, but the NFL does that for a lot of teams. If you go through the schedule, a lot of the division matchups are in the back half of the season for primetime ratings, playoff seedings, viewership, yada, 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 yada. So I do agree with Nick's point that if you are drafting Miami Dolphins, maybe trading them before the deadline, if he's not named Tyreek Hill, maybe trading them before the deadline isn't a bad idea. But I wouldn't shy away from an offense that is going to score a lot of points, who does have the 7th easiest strength of schedule overall in terms of the league. And they do get 2 gimme games against the Patriots, so that's really nice. Yeah. Number 3, who do you got?
I'm going with the 49ers, and the 49ers.
Oh, man, we're just doing a Spider-Man meme point at this point so far.
I think the 49ers, a lot of people would argue they're one, but in 2023, the 49ers had the QB6, the RB1, wide receiver 14, wide receiver 15, and tight end 5 in PPR. Now, this is even better if you're in the not fun league, the not fun scoring system of standard, because the wide receivers finished 7, 10, and Kittle was the tight end 2. Everyone on this team can finish at 1 at their position any single week, just like we said about the other 2 teams, which is a big upside for fantasy. And the 49ers last season had the most total fantasy points per game over any other team and the 3rd most points per game in actual football. Here's the concern, and here's why they couldn't crack the number 1 spot, which they probably were last year, or the number 2 for me. They averaged the 6th least plays per game because they are so efficient that they don't need to ramp up the offense. They don't need 65, 70 plays in order to be efficient. And that's fine. That's fine for football, but it's not great for fantasy. So when you have guys like Brandon Ayuk, who had a great season, finished a wide receiver 14 in PPR, the gap for him to finish at wide receiver 7 is the fact that he only caught about 4 catches per game, a little bit over. None of the high value receivers, Debo, Kittle, or Ayuk, are going to see a 10 target game. It does not happen unless there's injury. And Kyle Shanahan, his system is great. It works for that. But again, the schedule is not great for them either. When you finish as the top dog, you get the top teams to play against. And this season they're going up against 10 defensive head coach matchups, which is not great. And another one, 2 other quick reasons. A, injury concern. Debo, Kittle, McCaffrey have not been able to stay healthy for most of their careers. And then you look at the ADP across the board. They're all exactly where they need to go. Their ADP is very similar to where they finished last year. If they all stay healthy and they all do well, they will finish there. But frankly, Brandon Ayuk is not going to finish as a top 5 wide receiver in this offense. Debo Samuel is not going to. George Kittle might finish in the top 3, top 4, but he's only going at 5 or 6. So it's not like you're really getting any steals. And obviously, Christian McCaffrey is locked and loaded 101 every single year. So there's no real value to drafting any of these guys, which is why I couldn't edge them up the board. But I do think that they are going to be one of the elite offenses for a third or fourth straight consecutive season.
My other notes here, they're tied for the second most touchdowns last year at 61. They had the 12th hardest strength of schedule. Doesn't worry me because I still think they'll be one of the best teams in the league, but it will be a harder schedule. I think Brock Purdy has incredible value going off the board at quarterback 11. He could end up being your backup, who could end up being your starter throughout the season. A lot of fantasy champions probably, rode Brock Purdy last year. But this is an offense to me that is a little bit too loaded, where I'm looking at the Houston Texans and I could see the ball being spread around a little bit more. My worry with the 49ers is it's the McCaffrey show, and that's it. And if you're drafting a 49er, honestly, you're hoping Brandon Ayuk gets traded because it's a lot more targets for Debo, a lot more for Kittle. I don't see the rookie really eating into that. I do see Ayuk eating into that, but I think that's the best case for this 49ers offense. And I might even make an argument that they're number 2 if they traded Brandon Ayuk for the fact that both Debo and Kittle a bump. And right now it's hard to do that. If you're drafting Debo, Kittle, or Ayuk, you should never hope for an injury, but there is part of you that is kind of sort of banking on the targets going up due to an injury due to the other two. I hate to say it like that, but there's only so much ball to go around, especially when they're going to be up in a lot of games. McCaffrey is the motor. Again, like the Texans, I love Joe Mixon, but Mixon isn't McCaffrey. He's not going to get the amount of touches that McCaffrey will get. But I think Mixon could get comparable goal line work. So that's why I'm more okay with the Houston Texans stacked offense than I am with the 49ers. But I have the 49ers ranked above Houston because I do see them scoring more points as a team, being more dominant, more points to go around, better team, better football team, better offensive line, etc. Number 2, who do you got?
This team, I really struggled where to place them. I went as high as 1 at one point and as low as 4. But when I look at the value on the board, I could not help but just slam my hand down and say this is the number 2 offense in football. I'm going with the LA Rams, and I don't know if they cracked Nick's top 5.
They didn't. They came really close. And the thing that put me against the Rams is that you're looking at, and you could give your point after, but the reason I did not put the Rams is that Puka Nacua and Kyren Williams are so top heavy. I like Stafford's value, but after that, Kupp's still up there as well. But after that, it's very, very top heavy. Maybe that goes against some of the other teams that I do have here, but I did come very, very close to putting the Rams on my list. They are not my honorable mention, but they were. I toyed with them in Houston, so it's a good pick.
So, no, I totally agree with that. And to that point, that's exactly why I did put them higher, because they are so top heavy. And for me, that's good for fantasy football. I don't want, like Nick said, the San Francisco 49ers, where you have 5 guys competing for 60 touchdowns. Like, that's a problem. It's a good problem some weeks, but it doesn't give you high ceiling when you have 5 options. Here, it's very clear. It's Kyren, it's Puka, it's Kupp. Those are your 3. They all have a super safe floor. They're 3 elite players with Matthew Stafford, who is a talented stat sheet stuffer, which we love for fantasy football. And after the bye last year, they were one of the top offenses in football. They averaged over 28 points per game, the 3rd most fantasy points per game, and they were a top 5 in offensive plays per game. So they are checking a lot of my personal boxes. And then Kyren Williams last year, he missed 5 games, and he still finished as the RB7 and averaged the 2nd most points in fantasy football. And now he's going off the board right where he finished as the RB7. Puka's going into his sophomore year. Is he going to break out? Well, he was the wide receiver 4 last year, and we watched it work out for Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson, the other 2 that cracked the top 10 in their rookie season. So why not bank on that? And it's an even better value. I love Cooper Kupp. He's going off the board as the wide receiver 22. Every report out of training camp has been that he is the same exact Cooper Kupp. I think there's too much trepidation and concern that he's going to wind up like Michael Thomas, where he had the great season, and then you just watched injury derail him every single year. I don't think that's going to be the case for Kupp. I think he's way too talented. I think the injuries concerns, they're there, but every player gets hurt. I think Michael Thomas was the one that kind of got away, but we watch Keenan Allen every year feel like he got a hamstring. You've watched Mike Evans.
I think Michael Thomas is a special case. It's just like year after year after year. I think it really is a special case. We do mention guys that are injury prone, guys like Saquon and McCaffrey, but they've bounced back. Michael Thomas never really bounced back. I think that's a very special case, and it's a sad case because an elite football player who won fantasy football championships.
100%. And I don't think that Cooper Kupp is going to be that. I think that's an outlier, and I think way too many. I've watched 3 or 4 fantasy shows already compare him to Michael Thomas, and I just think that's way too extreme. And then, of course, elite offensive coach and Sean McVay. Here's the only two concerns, which I couldn't make them number one. Stafford, Kyron, and Kupp, all three of them missed multiple games with injury last season. That is definitely a concern. And listen, we hope that they're healthy, but everybody gets hurt. It's fantasy football. We watched 60 quarterbacks start last season, which is an insanely high number. So injuries are going to happen. It's a longer season. We're seeing it more regularly. And it's just who's playing 14 to 15 games now rather than the full 17. And then last year, we expected them to have a major regression. And it looks like right now that they have not done that and will not do that. But it's possible that this is the year the regression came. Everybody predicted last year they were going to fall off a map, and they winded up being in the playoffs. And a lot of people picked them to beat the Lions in the first round and go on a Super Bowl run. So could this be the year? Maybe, but I don't think I've seen enough to say this is not a good or a great offense for fantasy football. And again, top heavy. 4 superstars can finish number 1 at their position any single Sunday.
My other concern is that their offensive line has declined after the Super Bowl run. That is my other concern. I have the Detroit Lions at number 2, and I know Nick made some valid points at putting them at number 5, but here are mine for putting them at number 2. Well, first off, their offensive line is great. And when you have a good offensive line, you protect your quarterback, your receivers have more time to get open, your running backs have running lanes. I like teams with good offensive line for fantasy football. How about Jared Goff? Finishes quarterback 7 last year, so he's got to be in the top 10 this year. No, he's not. He's going off the board at quarterback 14, which I think is absurd for a team that is going to put up a lot of points. Speaking of points, scored the 5th most NFL points last year at 461. They had the 3rd most touchdowns at 58, and they're bringing back everybody. They've only gotten better, so I think Jared Goff is a great pick. I know he doesn't have a lot of rushing upside, but I was kind of thinking about it earlier. Who does at this point? Josh Allen? Jalen Hurts doesn't rush a lot. He has the tush push, but he doesn't rush a lot. And Lamar Jackson. A lot of quarterbacks are mobile and scramblers, but there really aren't many guys out there who are running quarterbacks. I think Goff is just as mobile as anybody. He's just as mobile as a guy like Mahomes. He's just as mobile as a Burrow. Like, I'm not worried about his mobility. Is he going to score a bunch of rushing touchdowns? Maybe he'll get one. But my point being, I'm okay with taking Jared Goff as my second quarterback and playing the matchups, because I think the Lions are going to have a lot of good matchups. They do have the 11th hardest strength of schedule, which is a little bit of a concern for mine, but Dan Campbell doesn't shy away from that, and I trust a coach like that. They're very top heavy, like Nick said, but I'm okay with that because you know what? Laporta can finish as the tight end 1. Gibbs could finish as the tight end 1. I'm sorry, the running back 1 or 2, but he is my biggest concern out of all these ADPs. David Montgomery at running back 21 right now on the board is a really good value pick and handcuff if Gibbs just get injured. And again, we don't hope for any injuries, but especially when you're talking about handcuffs, you do need to mention that. And then we have Amon-Ra St. Brown, who might be my favorite pick in the entire fantasy football draft. Going off as a wide receiver 4, finished wide receiver 3 last year. I think he missed 2 games. He's just my favorite pick. Like, him and Breece Hall are really my favorite picks right now. And if you have picks like 4 to 8 in your fantasy draft, you're going to load up on 2 really good players. Amon-Ra St. Brown could finish the season with the most receptions, the most yards, and the most touchdowns. And that's not a hot take at all. That's a legitimate take. He can finish at number 1 in every single category. So when I'm looking at a team that is a sleeper quarterback and can finish with a number 1 wide receiver, number 1 tight end, and a top 5 tight end, to me, that's a great offense for fantasy football. And I want a piece of that offense. Even if I'm spending high draft capital, I would like to get a piece of that offense. Number 1, who do you got and why do you got him?
I keep wondering if we have the same one because I would have thought you said this team by now, but I don't know. I know you're in on them. I don't know if you're in on them at 1. I went for the Philadelphia Eagles.
We do have the same number 1. If you didn't have the Eagles at number 1, I was going to say, what are you doing as a fantasy analyst? Respectfully, what are you doing? Because there's too much talent on this team.
100%.
I let you go first. So whatever points you don't make, I'm just going to tack on.
Yeah, you could feel free to add on to me. But listen, they got 4 players that you can lock in every single week. You do not have a concern. Jalen Hurts, Saquon Barkley, A.J. Brown, and Devontae Smith. I think Dallas Goedert is also a guy that you can stack with Hurts. He's going so late in the draft now, I think, where you think he's a great value. All their ADP is either just right or a good value. Any single one of them, like I said, can finish number 1 at their position any given week. And if you have doubts about Devontae Smith, he finished in the top 5 3 times last season. So he has been an elite producer, or 3 times in the time that he's been with A.J. Brown. So The two of these guys absolutely work together. This offense is absolutely loaded. Last year, they scored the 7th most points per game in football, with the 4th lowest points per game at the running back position, which is extremely inefficient and ineffective. Adding Barkley, that number is going up. I mean, I have not been in on Barkley, but that's more so been situation than the player and the injury concern. I think that he's going to be spectacular this year.
I'm so in on Saquon Barkley last year, which is really funny because if you watch the show for 3 years now, I think we've both been out on Barkley almost every year. I'm so in on Saquon Barkley. Just to tack on some points here. Last year, as Nick mentioned, the Eagles scored 433 points, the 7th most points in the league. They scored 49 touchdowns, the 7th most. I know number 7 isn't really, crushing numbers, but that doesn't bother me. The Giants, and I remember these numbers because I talked about it, I think, on last week's show. The Giants last year were actually a little spoiler alert for later on in the show. The Giants numbers here, they finished with 266 points, the 3rd lowest overall, and 29 touchdowns, the 4th lowest overall. That is over 200 points and 20 touchdowns now available for Saquon Barkley.
Yep.
On top of that being available for Saquon Barkley, you cannot load up the box anymore. And if I'm not sure they were loading up the box, but you cannot load up the box.
So the stat was insane. It was like 87 to 90% of plays. There were 8 players in the box against the Giants for the last 3 years. Like, it's an absurd. I
was talking about for the Eagles, but you can make that point.
Well, yeah, for the Giants, for Barkley though. So Barkley was always
loaded boxes.
100%
almost.
He was always running into 8 players. Now he's going to be running into 7 or 6 because the wide receiver.
Well, you can't load up the box. So if you load up the box on Saquon Barkley and the Eagles, now you have A.J. Brown, who's a very fast receiver, and Devontae Smith running down the field. That's a 60-yard bomb. If you don't load up the box, you just give a little handoff to Barkley. And what about the other option? You fake the handoff to Barkley, and now here comes Jalen Hurts. This is going to be a very, very tough offense to defend in the NFL. I know that they had a regression in the last 6 to 7 games last year, but if they could kind of get their act together, this is going to be a very, very tough offense for teams to guard and really plan against and scheme against. But for fantasy football, if you get any of these guys, you should be pretty happy with their outcome. Last point I'll make, 11th easiest strength of schedule. The NFC East is garbage. Even the Cowboys, they're like, the Cowboys are fine, they're whatever, but it's a garbage division. The Eagles are going to wall up the Commanders, they're going to wall up the Giants, and the Cowboys games will be explosive. They're in an easy NFC. The teams that they're going to face next year, because they finished 2nd in their division, I believe. So they're going to face, off the top of my head, I think they're facing like the Saints, the Rams, and the Packers. Packers week 1. Good games all around. I'll be stoked to get an Eagle on my offense. I think me and Nick are right on the money with that one.
I got a few more points I want to read off real quick.
Sure. Yeah,
they
load them up.
also ran the 7th most plays per game, which is insanely high, and they go for it on 4th down more than any other team because of the tush button. Very simply, that's more plays, that's more touchdown opportunities. I mean, it's simply put. And then on top of that, they brought in Kellen Moore to be their offensive coordinator. And if you don't remember Kellen Moore, 2 years ago, he was with the Cowboys, who had the 4th most points per game. And then last year with the Chargers, when they were fully healthy, averaged 29 points per game with the 2-star receivers, which the Eagles have, and 26 points per game after Mike Williams went down. So Kellen Moore knows how to run an elite offense, and he's going to do that with Nick Sirianni. Like Nick mentioned, the strength of schedule, way easier. He gets the NFC instead of getting to go against Sean Payton and Andy Reid every single year. Like, this is way, way better. Now, the only concerns that I really have is Jason Kelce going?
I was just about to say that that's
the tush push for Hurts.
That is my biggest concern.
Which might go away from Jalen Hurts being the QB 1 or 2, but he still has the upside of top 5 regardless. And then it just opens it up to handing the ball to Saquon Barkley. So it's not like it's really going to get totally deteriorated. I think the loss of Jason Kelce definitely hurts the offense, but I still think they're the best offense in football. And Nick mentioned it earlier, the cold streak at the end of last season. That was definitely something to be concerned as an Eagles fan for real football. But I think Kellen Moore and Saquon Barkley are going to be total difference makers for this offense. I think Nick and I are kind of on the money here. I think the Eagles are going to be the number 1 offense in real football, in fantasy football. And I think every single team in the NFC is going to be scared of going up against that offense.
If they're not number 1, they'll be top 3. We are saying they're going to be number 1. They would have to just really, underwhelm expectations. But let's talk about exceeding your expectations. Nick, who is your team that maybe didn't make the top 5 and maybe they don't finish top 5 and maybe they finish somewhere in the top 10 and you think they're going to exceed expectations?
So I don't think they're finishing in the top 10, but I will say that I think that this team is going to exceed a lot of expectations. I'm kind of on the take of, I may be approaching bold real football take and saying that they're much better than they actually are. I referenced it last video, last podcast. I think the Tennessee Titans are going to be a lot better than people think. Last year, they ran the ball 44.3% of snaps with Derrick Henry and Vrabel. Both of them are gone. They threw the ball the 4th lowest amount of times per game. And who did they bring in to replace Mike Vrabel? They brought in Brian Callahan, offensive coordinator for the Cincinnati Bengals, who threw the ball the 6th most times per game and runs one of the most vertically challenging offenses for any team. And on top of that, you bring in speedster Calvin Ridley, who just got paid, and as Nick and I always say, follow the money. They bring in Tony Pollard, Mr. Breakaway Speed, as our guy Skip Bayless, shout out, leaving FS1. They bring in breakaway speed Tony Pollard, who I think is going to be phenomenal in this offense. Tyler Boyd's now your wide receiver 3, which is great. They still have DeAndre Hopkins. And Will Levis.
He was a bit banged up, so hopefully he's not too banged up.
Hop's a little banged up. It sounds like he avoided serious injuries. I know we're not really doing news at this point of the season, but it sounds like he's going to be good to go by week 2 or 3 anyway. So that should be fine. And then outside of that, the question marks at quarterback, I get it, Will Levis. But he's a gunslinger, man. And if you put a gunslinger with a vertical offense, I don't care if he throws 20, 25 interceptions. He could go have a Jameis Winston season with 30 and 30. That's still great for Mike Evans and Chris Godwin's production. Why can't it be for Calvin Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins? And the best part about this is you don't have to pay anything fantasy-wise to take them. The earliest guy going off the board is Calvin Ridley at 74. If you're in a standard 10-man league with one flex, which is the basic setup, and you fill out the entire starting lineup, Calvin Ridley is your first player on your bench. You do not need to invest any heavy draft capital into any of these guys that can kind of go ahead and win you a league. I think that the Tennessee Titans are going to be a slightly above average offense this year, but their stars are being drafted like they're going to be a bottom 5 offense in football. I just don't see that happening with all these changes and all these offensive players. I think it's one of the biggest outliers in football. They kind of remind me last year, the Colts, where they brought in an intense offensive coach. There were question marks about Michael Pittman because of a questionable rookie quarterback who there's more of a runner, here's more of a passer. Jonathan Taylor, we were concerned because of the rushing concern, but Tony Pollard's like a good runner. Like, it kind of just reminds me exactly of that. But the difference was you had to risk a 1st round pick on Taylor and a 4th round pick on Pittman, where this year you don't need to waste a starting position on any of these guys. I think that these guys are a slam dunk. I think that the community's really missing out on these. I think Calvin Ridley's ADP has got to climb before the draft. If I were drafting today, I would smash the pick 74 on Calvin Ridley. I think it's such a lock, but we'll see how it goes. But I might be too high on the Titans, but I thought
you were going to put the Titans here. So the team that I put is the Atlanta Falcons, and I'm not sure what the expectations truly are for the Falcons, but I can tell you where the Falcons were last year. 321 points, the 7th lowest in the league. 32 touchdowns, the 7th lowest in the league. People were screaming for touchdowns from the skill position players. Didn't happen. Arthur Smith is out of there. Desmond Ridder is out of there. Bring in Kirk Thuggins. Bring in, I think it's Raheem Morris, the head coach now. Yep. I love value around this board. So we're looking at Kirk Cousins going off the board at your quarterback 18. He did finish last year at quarterback 24, but he did get hurt. So the number's almost irrelevant. I could see Kirk Cousins pushing as a top 10 quarterback. I put that in my hot takes last week. Go listen to that show if you haven't already for my full analysis on that. But I think Kirk Cousins finishes as a top 10 quarterback this year. Bijan Robinson finishes the running back 12. He's going as the running back 2. I think he's going to finish as your running back 2 or 3. Drake London's going at your wide receiver 12. Finishes wide receiver 37 last year. But again, like the Kirk Cousins effect, look at the receivers he's had as top 10 fantasy receivers in the past decade. Justin Jefferson the last, 4 years. Before that, Adam Thielen was a very, very good receiver. But before Jefferson got there, even when Jefferson got there, he was still reliable. But Thielen was a top 10 guy for a couple years.
I think it was 1,000-yard receiver for 4 straight seasons.
And he had like 8 touchdowns every year too.
Yeah.
And then they had Stephon Diggs. On top of that, TJ Hawkinson, he got traded from the Lions, who we like, goes to the Vikings 2 years ago, and he's the tight end 1 from weeks, I think it was like 8 to 18 or whenever he was traded. Don't know those exact weeks. Point being, Kirk Cousins is our favorite stat sheet stuffer. Maybe not favorite. Dak Prescott's pretty good too. But Kirk Cousins is a really good stat sheet stuffer. So he's going to make these guys. I didn't even mention Kyle Pitts, who's going off the board at tight end 7 right now, was tight end 13 last year. On top of all of that, easiest strength of schedule in the league.
Yep.
Slam dunk. I had the Falcons finishing as a top 5 offense. I did bump them for this take here, but I think they could even finish as a top 5 offense with everything going around them. I think you're going to want somebody. I think you're going to want a Drake London. I think you're going to want a Kyle Pitts. I think you're going to want a Kirk Cousins, a Bijan Robinson. I think you're going to want one of these guys. So I wouldn't sleep on them. I would go out and get one of these guys and just watch the fantasy points just reel in for you every single week. Thanks to Kirk Cousins.
I really thought about putting the Falcons in my top 5 too. My only problem was I did a 10 takeaways personally that I took notes from last season and said, listen to these. And number 1 in big bold letters was, no matter what happens, do not trust the Atlanta Falcons.
But this is a different Falcons team than we have ragged on. Cordell Patterson is gone. There's no more Cordell Patterson.
It's the same Falcons that passed on Bill Belichick, took Michael Penix as a backup, and didn't trade for Lamar Jackson.
I don't care.
I don't know.
Fantasy numbers will be fine.
I believe in them, but I struggle just because of the organization.
All right. Now we are going to offenses that we consider bottom 5 for fantasy football. So these are offenses that we either don't want to target, or maybe there's one player we'd consider, but we are very, very worried about having a player on this offense. So who do you got? Number 5.
Number 5 is going to be the hot take of the day. Or maybe we'll see later. But top 5 or bottom 5, hot take of the day, Cleveland Browns bottom 5 offense. Last year,
I did toy around with it. They're not on my list, but that I did toy around with the idea.
Last year, they ran the most plays per game, which is actually great for fantasy football, as I mentioned. But they averaged the 16th least points per game in fantasy football, middle of the pack. So my prediction is pretty much they're going to return right to the median. They're not going to be this massive outlier that ran close to 70 plays per game. They're going to run closer to 60. If they run closer to 60, that puts them as a bottom 5 offense based on the pace that they played at last year. So I'm pretty much banking on the fact that they're not going to keep up the same production that they did last, the quantity of plays, which was crazy as an outlier. On top of that, more question marks. Deshaun Watson, he played 6 games last season. He had 61 completion percentage, 185 yards per game, 7-4 touchdown interception ratio. That's not great. You have Nick Chubb, your star running back, missing the start of the season. So do you draft Jerome Ford and risk it? Do you draft Nick Chubb and risk it? Again, question marks at the running back position. The offense looked way better with Flacco right before the playoffs. I read the stats for Deshaun Watson. If you heard those, that's not great. That's a bottom 5 quarterback in football, those statistically. Then you bring in as running backs, Jerome Ford, incredibly inefficient, 200 carries, less than 800 yards last season, 4 touchdowns. Then you have Dante Foreman, who we hope's okay. He had a big injury. He was in the hospital with neck injury. We hope he's okay. But if he's good to go at some point this season, he's 100% vulturing carries from these two, and he's not going to be good enough to start. Njoku was fantastic last season. Last year, tight end 1 from week 7 on. Here's the problem. Week 6 is when Deshaun got injured. So without Deshaun Watson, David Njoku was the number 1 tight end in fantasy football. Before that, he finished outside the top 10, which is where he's being drafted. Now you add Elijah Moore, Jerry Jeudy, 2 guys fighting for the number 2 and 3 spots on the offense. You have a lot of mid-level talent. And if you do not run 70 plays per game like you did last season, this team is just not going to be consistent enough for fantasy football. And on top of that, they have easily the hardest division in football. And last year in games against the division, they averaged 18 points per game. And you might say, well, what about when Deshaun was playing? Deshaun played 3 of them, and they averaged 16 points per game.
And the division only got better, I would say. The Ravens got better.
100%.
The Bengals probably got better, and so
the Steelers upgraded that quarterback, we think. Listen, I know the Browns players, they're hot commodities. You're going to say, ooh, Elijah Moore, Jerry Jeudy, late round value. Running backs, late round value. Amari Cooper, clear cut number 1. David Njoku finish off hot. They're hot commodities. But I guarantee you that if you draft the Cleveland Browns offense this year, that they are individually going to lose you weeks. You're going to look at a Jerry Jeudy 1 for 11, and you're going to be like, Why did I start him? You're going to look at the same thing happen from inconsistent Amari Cooper, who we always say at home is the dog, but on the road, absolutely terrible. And he was terrible in the division last season with Deshaun. So
he did win fantasy championships, though.
100%. He did. He did with Joe Flacco. Well deserved. Give him their props there, but I'm not buying into the Browns hype. I can't do it.
I will say this. My offenses I'm fading are really, really simple. They're kind of lazy takes, but they stink. They really do. Number 5 is the one that might be, I don't know if hot take is the word, but this might be the shocking one. And it's an offense that would have been on me and Nick's top 5 list the previous 3 seasons. Not anymore. The Chargers. I want no part of the Chargers. I am avoiding the Chargers like the plague for the most part. Justin Herbert, who I have claimed is a really good stat sheet stuffer, and I've been kind of, all over him. The thing is, he's actually not that great of a stat sheet stuffer because he finished outside the top 10 in 2023. He finished outside the top 10 in 2022. 2021, he finished as a quarterback 2, great season. And 2020, he finished as quarterback 9 in his rookie season. But for his last 2 seasons, he hasn't even finished the top 10 quarterback, and he's being drafted outside the top. What?
He was hurt last year.
Okay, 2023. What's the excuse?
Last season was 23. 22. I don't remember. Probably didn't just play as well.
Well, I'm
going to say, well, they brought in Kellen Moore last year.
I think he's a fine backup, I guess, but I'm not enticed by any skill position player. McConkey, the rookie, maybe I'll take a shot on him later in drafts. Either running back, I mean, you're just rolling the dice between J.K. Dobbins, who's probably going to end up being the goal line back. I'm sorry, J.K. Dobbins will not be the goal line back. That will be Gus Edwards. You're just drafting the Ravens running backs from last year with an offensive line who's not going to be as good as the Ravens' offensive line was last year. There's no receiving talent here that I'm really jumping for joy over. I have what's his name from last year, the rookie from last year. He's slipping my mind. On the Chargers. The rookie from last year.
It was breaking news.
What do we got?
It was Jonathan Brooks. Keep going. I'll find the news.
Okay. I can't remember. Do you remember his name? The rookie last year for the Chargers that just dropped every ball that's thrown to him.
I don't.
Quentin Johnston. I have on my dynasty team.
Yeah.
He's on my dynasty team, and I'm miserable that he's on my dynasty team. I didn't take Zay Flowers. So point being, there's really nothing that I like about this team. I mean, last year they finished with 36 touchdowns, the 8th lowest. They finished with 346 points, the 12th lowest. The only thing that I do like is that they're the 5th easiest strength of schedule. But I think this is a team in full rebuild mode, and there are better offenses. I see better players across the board, and the Chargers are just not one of them. Could they have been my offense that's going to not live up to the hype? Sure, my 5 and 6 were very interchangeable, but this is what I'm going with.
Sure.
Number 4, what do you got?
I'm going with the Raiders, and this might be one of my hotter takes.
You just hate Davante Adams for no reason. You have no reason to dislike Davante Adams.
Let me get to my take. But yes, I don't like Davante Adams. But I know Nick is probably doing the math in his head. Like, wait a minute, one of the bottom 4 teams that everybody has didn't make the cut. So you can keep doing that math. We'll get to it later. But I'm going with the Raiders. They ran the 3rd least amount of plays in 2023. They averaged less than 20 points per game. Their running back, Josh Jacobs, walks away in the offseason. Now they bring in, or they promote, Zamir White and Alexander Madison, 2 of the most inefficient running backs last year, who also combined for 1 rushing touchdown last year. They bring in Gardner Minshew, and you know what I say? 2 quarterbacks is no quarterbacks. That means you don't have a real true number 1 and the guy that you trust. So that doesn't work for me. The only reason I couldn't put the Raiders lower is Davante Adams, but I do not like his ADP, as I didn't last year and every single year, because I think again, he's being drafted at his ceiling. He does not have much room to grow beyond this. Right now he's going off the board right at or just outside the top 10 wide receivers, which is pretty much where he finished last year. And I just don't see that happening. I don't know how year after year we say Davante Adams goes at this range and we expect him to be a league winner. No, he's the safest probably pick in the draft because he's not going to finish lower than 20 because he gets so many targets, but he's not going to crack the top 5 because the offense isn't good enough. he goes right in that range, and the offense isn't good enough, period. So he's not really going to be a superstar. At some point, he's going to hit the age cliff. It's bound to happen. Last year was kind of the start of it, and I know the production doesn't really match it, but last year his yards per route run were the lowest that they've been in his entire career. He's been top 5 his entire time in Green Bay, and even his first year with the Raiders with Derek Carr, but this was the first year was outside the top 24. The inaccurate quarterback passing is not going to help that number at all. And again, 2 quarterbacks is no quarterback for me. The only thing that I really like is, he could get traded at some point this year. We'll see.
Yeah, and Nick becomes the biggest Davante Adams fan.
And then
fan of all time.
And as a disclaimer, I also hated Aaron Rodgers, but now he's, my Mr. Future Vice President quarterback.
You also don't have a reason to hate Davante Adams. He did nothing to you. He didn't lose you a fantasy game. He didn't cost you a fantasy game. He's not a rival. You really don't have a reason. You just think he's been overvalued for years.
I kind of think he's overrated. That's kind of the way that I've been on it. And then the other upside of the offense is Brock Bowers. But to me, I do think that his ADP is a little inflated, more so because we watched Sam Laporta and Dalton Kincaid dominate offenses, but they went into top 5 offenses in football. If you don't think the Raiders are a bottom 5 offense for fantasy, they're a bottom 10 offense in actual football.
I think they are bottom 10. I did consider them, but I see other offenses that I don't even want to touch.
And here's the worst part to me. And Nick, do you know the meme of like the dragon where there's like 2 serious heads and 1 joking head? Well, there's 3 serious heads, and it's the head coaches. It's Jim Harbaugh, it's Andy Reid, it's Sean Payton, and then it's Antonio Pierce. And I like Antonio Pierce. Seems like a good guy, but you are in a division of coaching masterminds, coaching legends, 3 Hall of Famers. I just don't think that it's going to work out too well for you.
I need to get you off the Sean Payton train. I can't do it.
I don't love Sean Payton, but he's a Hall of Fame coach, Hall of Fame Super Bowl winning head coach.
Yeah, but I will talk about the Denver Broncos. Not right now. But right now, let's focus on the New York Football Giants. Danny Dimes, maybe that's a nickname because he's only got a couple dimes in his pocket because, man, he looks terrible in camp. I follow a couple Giants fans on Twitter, and all I see is just how bad he is in camp. They went from Saquon Barkley to Devin Singletary, who was coming off the board at running back 29, and he was okay with the Texans, but he's going to be running into loaded boxes. Offensive line is still the offensive line. They had 266 points last year, the 3rd lowest, 29 touchdowns, 4th lowest. They have the 6th hardest strength of schedule. I don't like anything about the Giants. Malik Neighbors, I think, is an excellent talent, but I had the 2nd pick in my dynasty draft, and I'm not jazzed about taking Neighbors. I'm looking to trade that pick because I'm just not jazzed about taking Neighbors. I don't think the talent outweighs how bad this team is. And I think they really are a bad football team, and they're going to be going for a quarterback next year. And maybe that will inflate Neighbors' value as he sits on my dynasty bench. But I will take a shot at Neighbors in keeper leagues, but I'm not going out of my way to go get him because I know who's throwing him the ball. And I think there's probably 29 quarterbacks on the planet that are better than him. So
probably more.
Number 3, who do you got?
Well, you mentioned them earlier, and I mentioned their head coach. I'm talking Denver Broncos.
Yep, so am I. That's my number 3. There we go.
Yep, they had to wind up on the list at some point. Well, who's leading the charge? Because I said 2 quarterbacks is no quarterbacks. What about 3 quarterbacks? Because that's really no quarterbacks. And the guy they want to roll with was the 6th rookie quarterback taken off the board.
They have the dragon meme, but it's the dragon meme.
Yeah, it's 3 of those faces. Yeah. And last year they were one of the worst offenses in football, one of the worst operations and one of the worst offenses. They had the 4th least plays per game. They were bottom 10 in points per game. None of the quarterbacks have looked good in camp. The only reason they couldn't put them in the bottom 2 is because Javonte Williams and Cortland Sutton, where I don't think I will not be taking them this year. I've backed Cortland Sutton for years. I think Nick's been a big Javonte guy. Both of them have let us down.
I'm out. I'm out on all of them. Javante's their highest ranked player going in the draft right now at running back 32, by the way.
Yeah. And he has not broken out for the years that we've hoped. And there's been rumors this whole offseason, and I guess now that Cortland Sutton or Javonte will get moved at some point because they've gone full rebuild. And Javonte, he's not a rookie anymore. He's like a 4-year veteran. Cortland Sutton's been in the league for, I think this is his 7th or 8th season. So
I think we've seen the ceiling of every player on this team who's not a rookie, and that's my problem with this team. I think we know what we're getting, and none of it's good.
The only shot is that Bo Nix is slightly better than we think, and Sean Payton. I know like Nick doesn't believe in him. I don't really believe in him now.
I believe he likes money. I think he loves money, and he's a smart man for loving money.
But I do think that they have some I do think Javonte is a fine NFL player. I think Cortland Sutton's a good NFL receiver. I think Tim Patrick was very solid, and the offensive line is pretty good. So they do check some boxes, but I just think that they have one of the toughest schedules and one of the tougher divisions.
Actually, the 13th easiest strength of schedule, but kind of middle of the pack. Last year, they also finished with 357 points, 14th lowest, and 38 touchdowns, 14th lowest. So they were middle of the pack as an offense last year, but nobody on their offense finished within their top 25. So,
yeah, and here's the real problem I have. Unlike the other two teams that I said, in the Browns and the Raiders, this is the first team where there's not a single player that I can confidently start every single week. Like Devontae Adams, you can lock in every single week, and you can feel good about it. Amari Cooper, same thing. The Denver Broncos don't have anybody. Like, you have maybe a flex play when 6 teams are on bye. If you have 2 of your running backs out for Javonte, and as he's going off the board, it's the 32. And then Cortland Sutton, who, again, I think is a flex guy at best right now. I really hope he gets traded as well, because I do still think he's a good player, just with awful quarterback play. But, we have not seen it, so there's no reason to believe in them at this point.
All right. I gave all my points, so you just roll right into number 2. Who's your number 2?
I'm going with the New England Patriots. I imagine
you not have the Patriots at 2.
Oh, okay. I think I know who you have at 2 then. And you're
probably
2.
Do. You probably do. We're flipping a coin. So why don't you give your Patriots?
Yeah, it's one of the 2. But your 2 I don't have on my list. When we could get to that, you could ask me why later. Okay. But Patriots, again, 2 quarterbacks, no quarterbacks. Jacoby Brissett, the starter. Drake May has looked awful in camp. That's been the entire report. And again, one of the toughest divisions in football. You're going to have to play the Jets twice, the Bills twice. They had the least points per game in football in 2023. They were tied with the Carolina Panthers. They had the 5th lowest plays per game. They had the 2nd least fantasy points per game. And of course, they have that absolute elite wide receiver room. Kendrick Bourne, KJ Osborne, Tyquan Thornton, Jalen Reagor, Juju Smith-Schuster, Demario Douglas, and Jalen Polk, who, as everybody said at the draft, was one of the biggest reaches at wide receiver. So, again, New England misses at the wide receiver room. They've not been able to get it right in probably over a decade at this point, in the Julian Edelman, Wes Welker era. And listen, there was one reason I did not put them as the worst offense in football. And that is because I do think Ramondre Stevenson is still a talented running back. But they brought in Antonio Gibson, who I think is going to get 80 to 100 carries this season. So pretty much, not saying any of these guys are undraftable, but I don't think that I think Ramondre is the only guy that has a real shot to be a good player. And that would mean that the coach exceeds expectations. A young defensive-minded coach exceeds offensive expectations for the worst offense in football last year. And the rookie quarterback takes over early and is a lot better than we think. So I think a lot needs to go right for a lot of poor offensive players. I don't see myself taking a single New England Patriot this year.
The Panthers are a franchise that are screwed. They screwed their franchise. They gave the Bears a chance to turn their franchise around. Bryce Young is small, and I root for small guys, but he is small. He gets hit. The offensive line is horrendous. I know they drafted a receiver, but you just don't know what you're going to get out of that. There was nobody to catch the ball last year. There was nobody to run the ball last year. Their draft didn't, blow me away. They scored tied for the lowest points in the league at 236 with the Patriots. They had the lowest amount of touchdowns last year at 23. I know they have a new head coach and they did, draft a couple offensive pieces, but I don't want a Panther. They do have the 4th easiest strength of schedule, which is a benefit to them. However, I didn't see enough last year from the guys that were there to justify me saying that I think they can make a big jump unless a rookie really does surpass expectations. And in that case, I could hold my hand up and say I'm wrong. But when the quarterback is bad, and I do think that Bryce Young is, not only do I think he's kind of bad, I also think that he's now in the purgatory zone, that he's never going to get better. He's in the Sam Darnold zone. He's in the the Zach Wilson zone. I hate to just throw two Jets out there, but I'm just trying to think of other quarterbacks that come to mind. They really went into that purgatory zone. Trey Lance,
Josh Rosen.
Josh Rosen's a really good one. Manziel's a good one. So I don't think he's going to ever get better. And I'm not. He could be a backup in a couple years, but I don't know. So I don't want a Panther. Sure. Who's your number one?
I'm going the New York Football Giants. I actually think the Carolina Panthers are going to be. They were good enough to not make the bottom 5, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't think about them. I just think that Xavier Legette could be good. Jonathan Brooks could be good. Although we did just see he might be going on the PUP list and miss the first few weeks. So might regret my take at some point, but I'm going with the New York Football Giants.
The reason I had the Giants at 4 is because I think Neighbors is so talented and we've seen receivers flourish with bad offenses. So that is he is the one saving grace for the Giants. And my opinion is strictly that Malik Neighbors is better than or has more potential than any player on the Broncos, Panthers, or Patriots. That is my one caveat.
No, totally get that.
I'll let you go.
I'll give the Malik Neighbors take shortly, but listen, this is a team that averaged less than 16 points per game. They had the least fantasy points per game last season. They lost their 2 best offensive pieces. Saquon Barkley goes to the division rival, and then Darren Waller retires. Daniel Jones has been a bust up to this point in his career. 2 quarterbacks is no quarterbacks. Drew Lock has looked better in camp, and there have been reports circulating that he might be the week 1 starter. Their big offseason acquisition was Malik Neighbors, and they replaced Saquon Barkley with the most inefficient running back maybe of our lifetime in Devin Singletary, or one of the worst for fantasy that keeps getting a starting job. And then Malik Neighbors is the saving grace. But as I mentioned earlier, a lot of this is based on ADP, and I do not believe that Malik Neighbors can hit where he's going in fantasy football. Right now, he's going off the board around the wide receiver 19. Nick, I actually gave you both of these questions a few weeks ago in an earlier podcast. I won't give you the question this time, but I'm just going to tell people the stats. Since 2019, when Daniel Jones became the starter, the wide receiver leader in yards per game is Golden Tate with 46.3 yards per game. The only player in that 5-year span with Daniel Jones to catch a total of 10 career touchdowns, which would be 2 per season since he became the starter, or 3 per season since he became the starter, is Darius Slayton. Malik Neighbors, to be the Daniel Jones's number 1 receiver and to hit his ADP at where he's going right now, would need 80 catches for 1,100 yards and 8 touchdowns. Since 2019, when Daniel Jones took over, no Giants receiver scored over 50 catches, 770 yards, and 4 touchdowns in a single season. So the combination of all these things to happen, Malik Neighbors might very well be the most talented wide receiver to walk through that locker room in this span, but there's a lot that needs to go right for Malik Neighbors to hit that ADP. And I think he's going to be a big whiff. Not for the talent, because of the situation. Nick talked about QB purgatory. I think this is wide receiver purgatory. I think we're going to see kind of what we saw with DJ Moore in Carolina. The only difference was DJ Moore in Carolina was getting 170 to 180 targets. I don't think the New York Giants, who averaged the least offensive plays per game last season, are going to be able to keep up that production his way.
I had the Patriots at number 1 for all the reasons that Nick had them at number 2. 236 points, lowest in the league last year, 27 touchdowns, 3rd lowest. The highest ranked player at the moment being drafted is Hunter Henry at tight end 14. Last year, a lot of people were kind of all in on Ramondre Stevenson, who finished at running back 35. He also did miss the last 5 games, but his average was 12.1. Even if I took out the 2.9 stinker in the last game that he played, his numbers are 14.9, 15, 7, 6, 2.4, 18, 14, 7, 22, 13 bye. On top of everything that's been stated, they are tied for the 8th hardest strength of schedule. New coach, complete rebuild. I don't want a Patriot on my fantasy. And this is the team I don't think I would draft. Unless Stevenson, unless it's like round 10, 11, 12, and Stevenson's sitting there, I think I'll take a shot on him, but nobody else. Like that's really it. All right, your team that you don't think will hit their expectations. Who do you got?
Nick talked about him earlier, so I feel bad putting him on the list. And I really do love this team for football. And this will be back-to-back episodes where I've kind of not rip them, but I think that I've said that I think
You think they're getting overhyped, and they do have a lot of hype to live up to, and I do agree with that.
it's the Houston Texans. I think they're going to be very good for football. I just don't think they're going to be great for fantasy. Stroud, I talked about in the hot takes. I think he's a pocket quarterback, and pocket quarterbacks typically bust more often than they hit in fantasy. And right now, Nick mentioned earlier, going off the board as the QB6, but people are taking him as high as the QB3, QB4. And right now, he's got a defensive-minded coach, period. Simple as that. Pocket quarterback plus defensive coach does not equal elite fantasy production. It just does not happen. The one guy I do think has a very good ADP right now is Joe Mixon. But last year, the Texans were one of the worst rushing offenses in football. Granted, that might have been personnel.
You could argue how bad those running backs were, though.
Yeah, and again, I think that's more of a personnel issue. But if the running does go up, the receiving is going to come down. So one's going to go up, and three receivers, and right now they have three receivers going in the top 30, would be unprecedented. The only time that we've seen three receivers go in the top 20, three receivers finish in the top 30 since the year 2000 was the Pittsburgh Steelers, where they had Juju, Deontay, and Chase Claypool in 2020. And of those three, the highest wide receiver finish was the wide receiver 17. So you didn't even really see any of these guys thrive. They just did pretty well. And if you take that into the Texans situation, you have Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs both going off the board before the wide receiver 17. So for this to happen, they're going to have an unprecedented season, which I think CJ Stroud can do. Again, I hate it because I really do like the Texans. I think their roster is built for football. I have futures bets on them winning the Super Bowl from months ago before the Stephon Diggs trade. I really do believe in their talent. I just think for fantasy football, it's a tough situation. And then you walk in, and when they finish as the 1 seed, now they have the fourth toughest schedule in football. And the last 2 weeks of your fantasy football playoffs, they're going to go to Arrowhead, and then they're going to host Baltimore, who absolutely dog-walked them last year. So they got the tough schedule. They've got the tough situation. Their ADPs, they literally need to have one of the 10 greatest fantasy football seasons in the history of football to happen in a sophomore season with a defensive-minded coach. So I'm just saying, I don't think that you're going to have all of this all-time historic stuff happen. I'm going to bank on the side of history that it doesn't happen. They have 5 players going in the top 64. I don't think all 5 of them are going to finish in the top 64. I think it's as simple as that.
And that's okay. And I don't either. I know I have them on my list, but I want a piece of that offense knowing the potential. That's
100%,
a potential.
yeah.
That's a potential. We definitely have a little bit of a different mindset when it comes to some of these picks, and that's okay because my pick is the Pittsburgh Steelers, specifically because they finished 10-7 last year, and they go out and get Russell Wilson. They draft Roman Wilson just so they could finish 10-7 this year. I see no change in the Steelers. Mike Tomlin is a great Hall of Fame head coach, but he's great at not going under 500. I know Steelers fans that are just they are done. And as much as I love my favorite NFL player of all time, I think Russ is cooked. Yep. He has not produced a top 20 wide receiver since 2021. DK Metcalf, a wide receiver 14. I think DK Metcalf is on another level than any receiver that is suiting up for the Steelers this year. I was pretty high on
Pickens.
On who?
Pickens?
I was high on Pickens last year, but I think I've kind of seen his ceilings too. I think he's fine. I think Roman Wilson will be good. Freiermuth, every year I feel like people really want to put him into their top 10, then he doesn't hit that. Najee Harris has been effective in his career, but he does have Jalen Warren breathing down his neck, and I think both running backs will be used. I don't think we see anybody I don't think Russell Wilson finishes in the top 15. He might have even finished in the top 20.
I would guess. I'm going to predict right now. I'm going to give my hot take. I said it before. I don't think Russell Wilson's finishing in the top 30 because I think Justin Fields is taking the top
start. But even if Fields starts, I don't think he's finishing in the top 15. I don't think that either running back finishes in their top 20. I don't think either receiver finishes in their top 25. So what are you drafting for? Last year they had 304 points, the 5th lowest. and 31 touchdowns, the sixth lowest. They also have the third hardest strength of schedule. A Mike Tomlin team is grinding it out. They are playing defense. They're controlling the clock. And they're not controlling the clock with one running back. It's two running backs. Not like you, Jonathan Taylor, Christian McCaffrey. There's nothing enticing to me. Could I draft the Steeler late in my draft? Yes, I can. That's why they're not on my top 5. But I do think the expectation of expecting one of these guys to be a week-to-week starter and producing, I think that will not exceed expectations or meet the expectations that are expected of those players. Najee Harris, a guy who was going in the top 5 of the drafts before last season. What a fall from grace. But he did win me the points title in our league on the last play of the season, and that was electric, and I'm very happy about that. So I'm always indebted to him, so that's okay. All right, that is our show for this week. Thank you so much to all of you who have watched it. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to drop a like on this video. If you're not subscribed to the channel, make sure you're already subscribed. Hit that little bell icon to get notifications every time we either post a new video or go live. We'll be live every Sunday during the NFL season, early in the morning, to give you start sits, to give you news, to help you set your fantasy lineups. Please follow us and interact with us on all social media pages, including our Facebook. We do need to hit 100 followers before the season so we keep streaming on there. That's a Facebook thing and a new Facebook rule. So make sure you follow the Facebook page. It takes a couple seconds to do that. We're also over on Twitter and Instagram at PrimeTimeFFPod. Thank you all for listening, watching, and supporting, and we'll talk to you guys next week.